Hello and welcome to the Gallimaufry, a hodgepodge history podcast. Thank you for joining us again as we delve through the little-known back streets of history. My name is Will, and I'm joined by Nick. How are you today, Nick?
Bit worried about your navigation, particularly around these streets, but other than that, I'm all right. We've both been on holiday, actually, which is why this one's a little later than it is usually.
Yeah, so believe it or not, sometimes we do leave the confines of the basement of the carpet shop and we go to other places. So, and that's what's happened here. But we've been corralled back into our basement, or rather, I have. Nick stayed at home today.
Yeah, so there might be a slight difference in audio quality because I'm in a very echoey room. But yes, we've returned to our respective dens to metaphorically take you through back streets. Is that okay? Let's go with that then.
And speaking of back streets, one thing that you don't want to be looking in the back streets for is probably a reputable psychologist, which leads us very, very, very neatly onto the topic of this episode.
Thank God for the NHS. That's all I can say. Less backstreet psychology, more mainstream
Backstreet
psychology.
Boys.
I was waiting for you to say backstreet. It was in my head the minute you said backstreet.
Well, Backstreet's back, all right.
Yeah, we're back, just like they are. Well, they're not back. Are they back? They might. These bands always come back together, don't they?
I think didn't they regroup a few years ago. I don't know if they're still grouped or if they ungrouped again.
I mean, this isn't my wheelhouse, if I'm perfectly honest.
But hey, Sugar Babes, they regrouped. They're still going, aren't they? The OG Sugar Babes.
Well, they're not the OG Sugar Babes. I mean, are there any of the original ones left?
Yeah, they reformed the original Sugar Babes.
Well, even the ginger one.
I don't know. Whichever ones they were the originals. They were.
Remember that video? I just remember the video. That it was a completely ghostly white background, very, very well lit, and they were just all singing about trains or something like that.
Are you sure this wasn't like a fever dream of yours after watching too much Thomas the Tank Engine?
Oh, Thomas the Tank Engine was harrowing as a kid. I always remember the episode. Was it Gordon gets bricked up he gets bricked up in a tunnel?
Well,
just terrifying. Tugs was another one that really petrified me as a kid.
Not a fan of Tugs.
No. Do you remember that? There was one episode, basically Tugs was like Thomas the Tank Engine, but with boats. And there was one episode where they're carrying a tanker of oil and it explodes and there's fire on the water and it's just really harrowing because everyone's choking and burning and it's just this is for kids. This is for kids.
Again, I think this might have been a fever dream of yours. You probably need to stop watching classic children's TV programs before bed.
Yeah, they're too scary.
Yeah, you could watch Budgie the Little Helicopter. I don't think there was any kind of trauma in that, was there?
I've never heard of Budgie the Little Helicopter.
He was in a similar vein to the two other programs you mentioned. He was a helicopter with a human face.
I'm desperately searching for a segue to what we're supposed to be talking about. Speaking of trauma. Speaking of trauma, yes.
Yes. Well, who knew a lot about trauma, Nick? Go on.
What we're going to be talking about today is one of the most controversial social experiments of all time. It's in the top 5 of really controversial experiments. In fact, it was the last of what is now a bygone era that ushered in a whole new ethical approach to conducting social psychological experiments. But we're going to be talking about Stanley Milgram's experiments. In fact, he's probably the most famous social psychologist. Can you name another famous social psychologist? I mean, you can, because I've told you quite a few in the pre-chat before this. So that was a terrible question to ask you.
Sigmund Freud, wasn't he? He was quite famous, wasn't he?
He's a psychiatrist.
Oh, it's different, is it?
Oh yeah. My partner is she's not. She does something else. But her father is a psychologist.
Dr. Crippens, what was he?
I don't know. Probably just a regular medical doctor, I think.
But he was a bit psycho as well, wasn't he?
I mean, yes, he tried to murder people. That's usually a a sign that not all is well. But anyway, what are the Milgram experiments?
I may have the answer for you. So the Milgram experiments were a series of social psychology experiments which were conducted, as we said, by Stanley Milgram at Yale University in the early 1960s. So the experiments were intended to measure the willingness of the study participants to obey an authority figure who instructed them to perform acts which might conflict with their own personal conscience. The experiments, as you say, have become controversial because of the deception and the trauma experienced by the participants.
The very essence of Milgram's experiment, he did a number of different variations, but it was a baseline experiment where essentially a subject walks into a laboratory believing they're about to take part in a study of memory and learning. They are assigned a role of teacher after they draw straws with another person who they've never met, who turns out to be a Confederate. And
so not a man who's into succession of the southern states and slavery.
No.
I've got to say, the first time I read that, I was confused. Why does it? Where did they find a Confederate in the 1960s?
I mean, it is a word with its own meaning.
Yes. Good.
It's
a good thing you're here, isn't it?
And a Confederate is essentially someone who's in on the experiment. They were always going to be the learner, and the subject was always going to be the teacher. They're then sat at two desks. One is in another room, they're in another room, so they can't see them, but they can sort of hear them. And they're asked to administer a series of tests to teach word associations to a fellow subject. So it starts well. The learner gets a few right, so he doesn't have to shock. And then gradually they get things wrong. So they have to start increasing the shock with each wrong answer. And they're shown that the shock is real before the big experiment begins, even though it's not real. But they're given a sort of test shock. So you look, this is a real shock. You'll be doing this to that person. And in the room with the teacher is an experimenter in a sort of grey lab coat who basically encourages them to go on. And they have 4 prods to determine whether they're disobedient or obedient. And if they go to all 4 prods and still refuse to carry on, they're classed disobedient. But what Milgram found in his findings is that 65% of all subjects continue to administer shocks right up to the highest levels, which went up to about 450 volts, which is basically almost lethal.
Yeah, for perspective, here in the UK, mains voltage is about 240 volts, isn't it? And that'll give you a nasty shock, just that by itself. Yeah,
450 volts, I think, it's the point where you're getting electrical skin burns, your skin's breaking down. It's near enough to deliver a fatal current.
Yeah.
And can be fatal on most occasions, to be fair. But what was the point of these experiments? What was Milgram essentially trying to prove? He was trying to see about how much it would take, like in terms of a situation, for someone to sort of obey an authority figure and it compromise their principles. So things that people would say they would never do, like, I'd never kill anyone. He was trying to see what it took to inflict harm on another person because he was fascinated by the Holocaust. And he was really fascinated by the idea of how all these people in Germany could have gone along with the sort of Nazi program of extermination. And he wanted to see whether obedience was something inherent in human nature and it is something that that anyone could sort of be made to do these horrible things. But who was Stanley Milgram?
It's a good question. Let's take a moment to talk about the man who devised these experiments. So, Stanley Milgram was born on the 15th of August 1933, and he was born in New York City to Adele and Samuel Milgram, and he was the second of 3 children. His parents were Jewish and had both emigrated to the United States during World War I. His mother came from Romania, and his father came from Hungary. As a result of Stanley's parents being immigrants from Eastern Europe, many of Stanley's extended family were heavily affected during the Second World War, many of which ended up in Nazi concentration camps. Some of those who were able to survive came to live with the Milgrams in New York for a time after the war, and this exposed the young Stanley to the great suffering that they had endured. This seems like it had an effect on him. And at the age of 13, Stanley had his bar mitzvah ceremony, which is a customary coming-of-age ritual, commonly whereupon a Jewish boy is said to become a man in the eyes of his community. And Stanley chose to make a speech on the plight of the European Jews and the impact that World War II would have upon the international Jewish community. He later wrote to a friend from childhood that I should have been born into the German-speaking Jewish community of Prague in 1922 and died in a gas chamber some 20 years later. How I came to be born in the Bronx hospital, I'll never quite understand.
He was, he was a very intellectual child. He preferred reading science books to playing with his mates outside. But he's also a big fan of the arts, which maybe might explain his venture into it's a difficult word to say, into social psychology, because it's kind of a combination of science and theatre. As we'll see from we've explained what the experiment was, but we'll go into a bit more detail. But he would paint, he would write, he would even invent crazy things like dog collars with a radio built in. Yeah,
so as you say, he was a bright kid, and he eventually went on to achieve his bachelor's degree in political science from Queen's College in New York in 1954, despite allegedly not attending any of the tuitions. He was initially rejected from Harvard, but would eventually be accepted on a PhD program in social psychology, which he completed in 1961.
That's interesting, because he was rejected because he hadn't studied psychology. So they were like, well, you know nothing about this.
Yeah, he kind of had to take a crash course in it, didn't he, in order to essentially tick the box for Harvard.
Yeah, so it's incredible what he did, because reading it makes me feel tired. He spent all of the summer cramming in as many classes as he could. He took 5 subjects at 3 different colleges in New York City, on top of working nights as a clerk in a hotel.
Yeah, kind of puts us to shame a bit, doesn't it?
Yeah, I complain when I have to get up, before 8 o'clock.
But but in December of that year, 1961, Milgram married his wife, Alexandra, with whom he would have 2 children and live with for the rest of his life. Eventually, after years of working as a lecturer and assistant professor at Yale, Milgram was eventually offered a tenured position at the City University of New York Graduate Center in 1967, where he would go on to work until his death in 1984, while also tutoring a number of students who would go on to become eminent psychologists in their own rights.
But just going back to when he got accepted into Harvard, he began working with acclaimed psychologist Solomon Asch, who had conducted studies on group pressure a couple of times in 1952 and 1956. The volunteers would turn up for a supposed visual perception test with a group of 7 other people who were all Confederates. And as we know, we learned what Confederate means earlier. So they were all in on it. And They were shown... Yeehaw! It's not the Wild West.
I don't know.
The group was shown large cards, one with 3 lines of varying length, and another card with just 1 line, and they were asked to match which line out of the 3 on one card was closest to the single one on the other card. And essentially, the premise was that everyone else would sort of give the wrong answer, and they would see if the other person, the person who wasn't in on it, would go along with the group. So 12 cards were shown, and the group gave wrong answers 7 times. And he found that 3/4 of the answers were correct by the subject who didn't know what was going on. So some people gave the wrong answer at least once, whilst others gave multiple wrong answers to try and conform and fit in. So he was looking at sort of fear of disapproval, the guilt and the duty as the factors in giving the wrong choice, even when they knew what the right answer was. So that you can sort of see the sort of environment social psychology was taking. It was looking at behaviour, and it was using these weird theatrical deceptions to sort of get to the bottom of human nature, I guess. And he assisted in some of these experiments, Milgram. He actually assisted in debriefing subjects, because Asch was very interested in figuring out what people felt, what they thought, and sort of noting it all down. And this led Milgram to conduct his own PhD experiment to begin with, where he did a sort of similar thing. He had a very grand, ambitious plan, as he always seems to do initially. He wanted to compare multiple European nations, but in the end didn't have the budget all the time. So he ended up trying to compare cultural differences between the Norwegians and the French.
Okay.
So his experiment was volunteers arrived at a specific time to a lab. They found a series of 5 doors and a pile of coats on a bench. So it looked like the places were occupied, basically. The volunteer was taken to a 6th room with a microphone, and their task was to judge the length of 2 sounds, picking the longest sounds. They would hear every other room pick the sound first, And of course, they all picked the wrong answer. Milgram found that 60% gave the incorrect answer to agree with others.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It turns out the Norwegians turned out to be slightly more conformist than the French.
So, I mean, these experiments, these are all kind of performed sort of still in the aftermath of World War II and the Holocaust and the atrocities. And this has quite a lot of influence over the incentives for studying these areas.
Yeah, so social psychology, like many things during warfare, becomes a tool to sort of help win the war. So the army and the navy and all the various different armed forces were looking at improving troop morale, helping with rationing, helping select the best soldiers for the best situations. It became a testing ground for very elaborate situations, really horrible situations. So you had tests involving simulating plane crashes, which the participants didn't know was real. So they were oh, this plane's about to crash. What are we going to do? But this was part of the process. They wanted to see the harmful effects, the harmful reactions that people had in these situations in order to then help save lives in future and deal with situations better.
I mean, this is the era, though, isn't it, of controversial, ethically dubious studies. So this is the time of MK Ultra, all these kind of really kind of slightly shady things happening at the same time that have gone on to become sort of quite notorious.
In fact, Zimbardo, who was another famous psychologist who was famous for his own controversial experiments, which is a whole other topic for another day, he described psychology in like the 1950s and early 60s as a sort of Wild West.
Yeah.
American behavioural psychology had sort of been undertaking a shift since the 30s because of Hitler. So Hitler had a weirdly profound effect on it unknowingly because all the Jewish psychologists left and they brought the essence of Gestalt psychology with them, which had a focus on understanding an event by understanding how it was perceived by the person experiencing it. This was a marked change from simply observing behaviour without really asking questions about it, which had dominated North American psychology.
Yeah, we're also a period dominated by several quite large-profile Nazi war crime trials, where the question is raised, what makes a person do these terrible things? Is it because they're just following orders, or is it because they are inherently bad people? The trial of Eichmann was going on not long before Milgram started his first experiment.
I think it started almost exactly a year before he started his experiments. In fact, in his book, which he published in 1974, he writes, could it be that Eichmann and his 1 million accomplices in the Holocaust were just following orders? Could we call them all accomplices?
For a Jewish man of the son of Eastern European immigrants, that must have been quite a delicate subject.
It was, and in fact, this whole experiment sprung from the desire to know him personally, to know why so many had followed Nazi orders during the war. He wanted to compare obedience in the US to that of Germany. In fact, but he didn't actually say this in his research funding application to the Office of Naval Research. He actually reframed it around the context of the Cold War, because there was a sort of moral panic after the Korean War about American POWs sort of being brainwashed and obeying their masters. So that was the sort of context he was working in. But the essence of the Holocaust was very much the influence in his own research.
Yeah, I think
it was all about understanding. Like, he framed it to his funders as about framing, how do we get maximum obedience from someone? If you command someone to do something that violates their own standards, how much information do you have to present? Do you have to tell them the worst of what they need to do from the start, or do you gradually escalate it? And that's where we get the Milgram experiments. That's where they begin to form.
So this is the background at the time. This is what's going on in the world, and what is driving psychologists like Milgram to study the human psyche in this sense. So it's 1961, and Milgram is awarded a grant for his proposal to undertake a series of experiments where he is looking to ascertain the willingness of participants to obey the instructions of an authority figure. The experiments began on the 7th of August in the basement of the Lindsley Chittenden Hall at Yale University. The experiment intended to provide some insight into the question of what would drive a person to commit such atrocities as those which came to be associated with the Holocaust. The question being, was there any truth in the claim that they were just following orders, or did the perpetrators bear the full responsibility of their actions? At the time of conducting the experiments, Stanley Milgram was working at Yale University in one of a number of lecturing roles. As such, he took it upon himself to poll 14 senior year psychology majors to try and predict the outcomes of the experiments he was going to do. The respondents were unanimous in predicting that only a very small minority of teachers would actually be prepared to inflict the maximum of 450 volts. Of the few who predicted that one or more teachers would go so far, the average number was still only about 1.2. Milgram also polled his colleagues, finding similar predictions, as well as 40 psychiatrists from a medical school. The psychiatrists, a little bit optimistically, predicted that most subjects would stop the experiment by the 10th shock at most. Overall, they believed that only a little over 0.1% of the subjects would actually administer the highest shock on the board. So just to clarify, when we mention shocks, the teacher or the subject is led to believe that they have that the machinery in front of them has a dial, and that dial administers shocks to the learner that they can't see. And this dial goes up in increments of 15 volts. So it starts at 15. And each time the learner gets a question wrong, they have to turn it up one notch. So 15, 30, 45, all the way up to 450 volts. The dials also had a few labels stuck at certain points on the dial. And these had little warning labels ranging from slight shock to danger, severe shock.
We talked briefly about what the process was, and we'll delve more into actually step by step what the experiment meant. So just to clarify, those polls he conducted turned out to be very surprising, because he did a preliminary trial using students from the university, which was actually a common practice among the time. In fact, his experiments involving real people was actually kind of an anomaly, because usually it was just students roped in to sort of take part in the experiments. But even the results of just using students in his preliminary test, where he was sort of refining the process of conducting the test, the set, how the actors interacted with the subjects, he found that 85% went to the maximum voltage, which it really surprised him. So he kind of revved him up for the real thing with what he considered ordinary working Americans.
So even people who possibly might have been more aware of the purpose, they might have been having a good guess of why they were being studied.
Yeah, well, that's one thing we'll come to in the sense of how aware were people when taking part in the test of what was going on. And it's something that Milgram wrestled with in terms of trying to keep everything secret and trying to dupe the people taking part. But yeah, as you said, they sort of started. The real experiment started on the 7th of August in 1961, after sort of running the preliminary tests with students from about October 1960 onwards to 1961. He actually didn't just run one experiment. He ran 24 separate conditions. So he would vary. He wanted to get as a complete data set as possible. So you had the baseline, which was obviously just the reading out the pairs and shocking, but then he added in sort of different conditions all the way through. And it's important to clarify at this stage, he didn't include any women in this. It was all men. It was only in the very late stages, in what he termed condition 20, that was exclusively women, that they were actually looked at as a group. But the conditions were quite interesting, because they ranged from... So condition 1 was like the baseline condition, but the learner does not cry out at all.
Okay.
Condition 5 was one where the learner mentions they have heart trouble at the beginning of the experiment and protests about it during the experiment. So it adds another level of jeopardy. There's one condition where the experimenter takes an important phone call and just leaves before the experiment. So he looked at all these different sort of conditions. The main essence of the experiment was the subject would come in, they'd meet the learner, they'd move to separate rooms, and they'd start the experiment with the experimenter saying, ask these pairs of word associations. If they get it wrong, shock them. And as you said, they'll increase the shock level. The learner wasn't actually acting their screams and cries as they got shocked. It was actually playing through a loudspeaker. It was all pre-recorded. It was all meticulously planned. The script was written by Milgram. The actors involved were very diligent at what they were doing. So it was all fantastically set up.
You mentioned earlier that it was only men who were allowed to do the experiment. I actually saw during the research, I saw a copy of the advert that Milgram put out asking for volunteers. He put it out in New Haven, and he was asking for people to volunteer for a study of memory, for which they would be paid $4 for 1 hour of their time, which is about $39 today. And the advert actually specified that the volunteers should be between the age of 20 and 50, but did not require any particular training, education, or experience. It actually went as far as to list a broad sort of spectrum of careers, both manual, professional, and sort of other, from which Milgram was keen to source volunteers. So he was looking for very, I guess, normal, average people. He wanted to make sure that it was a good spread of, I guess, society at the time.
No, exactly. Like his initial recruitment drive was in a Sunday newspaper, which had a circulation of over 100,000. And yes, he advertised for, as you say, common man, labourers, clerks, salespeople. He was looking for the everyman, basically, because he wanted to find out whether the average man would do the horrible things that we'd witnessed in Germany. Unfortunately, that didn't go so well. He only received 296 responses from that massive circulation. So he tried directly mailing letters to over 2,000 people in the New Haven area, taken from the phone book. And he had this weird system of like picking the first name from each list and then mailing and mailing.
Maybe he should have offered a bit more than $4 if he wanted a higher take-up.
Well, to be honest, $4 for 1 hour of time, and they could choose the hour. Was he saw that as quite a good offer. I'd probably have taken that if I was at the time. But yeah, there was a specific person in mind, because obviously he was targeting the everyman who maybe needed a bit of money.
Yeah.
And that was his impression, that he would just get people who thought, "Oh, I just want some cash." But actually, a lot of the people that were involved in the experiment that were talked to subsequently by him and his colleagues, and also by authors and journalists who've written about the subject, found that a lot of people were actually interested in the subject that they were recruiting for, because it was framed as a memory and learning experiment. The whole purpose, which we haven't actually outlined, which is quite important, of the experiments was that they were framed as a memory and learning experience. So they were looking into, does punishment help you memorize things better?
As you mentioned, he was quite meticulous in his planning. So when the volunteers came in, obviously they were promised $4 for their time, and they were told on the outset, you will get your $4 regardless of the outcome of the experiment. So they could have come in, they could have walked off after the first shock, and they'd still get their $4. They were all very clear on this.
However, there were, as we mentioned, there were 4 pre-scripted prods that the experimenter, which was an actor, could prompt to make them continue. So if they objected, he would say, firstly, please continue. If they objected again, he said, the experiment requires you to continue. Third was, it's absolutely essential that you continue. And fourth is, you have no other choice but to continue. Now, these prods, remember these prods, because they become quite important in a bit. But I think it's probably time to talk specifically about the actors who are involved. It was meticulously planned. Like the stage, the setting, the shock machine, everything was designed and built to convey this as an authentic experience as possible. But the 2 key things were the actors themselves.
The learner was a man in his 40s who, like the teacher, had volunteered to be part of the study in exchange for that $4 reward, but not really. He was a man in his 40s, but the rest of it was bollocks. In reality, he was a railroad auditor called Jim McDonough, who had been roped into playing the part of the unsuspecting victim in Milgram's experiment. Interestingly, McDonough never mentioned his part in the experiment to his family, who only became aware of it 12 years later in 1974, when the TV programme 60 Minutes aired a segment on it. By that time, McDonough had been dead for 7 years, making it a bit of a shock for his younger children, for whom seeing their father on TV was the first they had ever heard his voice or seen him in motion. It probably sounds like quite a sweet moment, before you consider that the footage involved their dead father being strapped to a chair and pretending to scream in pain while a stranger asked him to memorise questions. As it turns out, McDonough actually did have a heart condition, which is what led to his death at the young age of 49.
Yeah, it's incredible that because the reason he took part in the experiment was because it was good money. In fact, when the experiment began, he was paid by the hour, and he was paid initially $1.75, and then it rose to about $2.25 by the end.
I mean, I'm no mathematician here, but the other guys were getting paid $4 an hour.
Yeah, but they only did it once.
I wouldn't have been happy about that. No, you paid me $4.
So he had 9 children. And as you said, if one of his sons was 3 when he died, so seeing your dad for the first time in pain must have been quite shocking to come across. But and it's weird how he never ever talked about it. But what's even more weird is that when he had his heart attack, the morning he had his heart attack, his neighbour across the road was actually a subject who took part in the experiment, who ran across to try and help. He was a firefighter named Harold.
Yeah.
But by the time Jim had sadly died. But it was kind of like a weird twist of fate. Like he came in and he recognised him and thought, oh, I know you. But yeah, MacDonald was chosen because he had the look that Milgram was searching for. He was a kind of robust-looking man. He was a bit stout and sloppy, as Milgram described him. Amiable, but not very intelligent-looking. You know, the typical American guy, what you'd imagine an American guy to look like.
Okay, like the dad in a 1980s sitcom is what I'm imagining.
Yeah, but a thinner Peter Griffin in essence.
Yeah.
But yes. And so, he played the role of the learner, and he basically pre-recorded a load of lines where he got the things wrong and screamed a lot and cried, and
It sounds like he had a great time.
Yeah, he did. The other important person was Jack Williams, or John Williams, because annoyingly, Jack and John would seem to be interchangeable as names at this time. Yeah. He was the experimenter. Now, he was a high school teacher. Described as impassive and stern by his children. He was the type that projected authority. And he took the job to support his family because his dad had just had a stroke and he was helping him run a restaurant business. And again, despite playing a pivotal role, he never talked about it to his family, not even his wife. Likely Milgram swore both of them to secrecy, and that was something he protected scrupulously. But he had a long career actually as a teacher afterwards as well. He spent 3 decades in the teaching system. He was described as a bit of an authoritarian. He was conscientious and hardworking as well. So sort of fit the mould of what an experimenter should look like. And apparently he looked like a scientist. You'd expect to see a scientist. And that was important in creating this illusion for Milgram. He was actually also paid more than James as well. He was paid $2 an hour when it began, rising to $2.40 by the end.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
He also went on to write the soundtrack to Star Wars.
This is different John Williams, sadly. Different, yeah. I spotted that as well. I was like, is it the John Williams? I was like, no. So I mentioned earlier there were 24 different conditions. In one condition, he actually changed the actors, Milgram. He changed them. So he swapped out Jim, who was this friendly, affable-looking man who you'd hope would evoke sympathy, for a tough-looking railroad worker named Tracy.
Okay.
Hard as nails, mate. Who weirdly,
Tracy.
Yeah.
Tracy was a man, was he?
Yeah, he was a man.
Okay, just clarifying. Yeah.
Yeah, back then Tracy was a man's name.
Yeah.
And weirdly, he would also die from a heart attack shortly around the same time as Jim. And then he replaced Jack, the teacher, with a gentler-looking individual. And he found that in that specific condition, obedience dropped to 50% from 65%. Okay. Now, it's not entirely clear if this is just because of the appearance or if it was poor acting or who knows, but that was the only time that he substituted them out. But they would play pivotal roles, and they both kind of grew into the role as well, particularly Jack Williams. So what about the effect on the people that took part? Many subjects who actually took part in this came to regard the experiment as a test of their own character, one that either they passed or failed, and it's something that Milgram would assign. He looked at it in a very moral lens as well. One subject, 116, said, I was really ashamed of myself. I kept thinking, why didn't I refuse to give pain to my fellow man instead of going through as directed? They also spoke to another friend who had taken part as well, who had stopped earlier, which just made them feel even worse. Shockingly, a lot of individuals who took part in this experiment weren't told it was fake afterwards. They were debriefed, but they were told another complete lie, and basically their conscience was put at ease by Milgram or someone else. No, it's okay, it's all part of a test, don't have to worry about everything. It's incredible to think that a lot of people walked out of doing the experiment thinking that they had inflicted pain on another human being.
Yeah, so these people were essentially allowed to live their lives bearing the burden of guilt of effectively torturing another human being.
Yeah, I mean, the learner would come out and say, I'm fine, I was just a bit overexcited. But it's still like crazy. I mean, at the time, debriefing, as described by the Ethical Standards Guide, produced in 1953, made no mention of telling someone the truth afterwards. It focused on stress reduction, which is presumably why they tried to assuage people's fears about damage to someone. But also they didn't want people knowing the truth and spreading it out around New Haven, because he was drawing from a what you would consider a large but also small pool where they could sort of talk and reveal the experiment. In fact, It would take 11 months for Milgram, in July 1962, for Milgram to send a report with the truth to the subjects. Around 600 people left the lab believing they shocked someone. Subject 216 described it as the most unpleasant moment of their life. Subject 711 described having nightmares for weeks afterwards. It was just insane. And as we said, women made an appearance in condition 20. 40 women were tested across March and April, and they took part in the first variation and also variations involving the heart attack script. He found similar results, but he found that they endured more stress, and they protested as well, quite vigorously.
So they still did it, but it caused them more stress.
Yeah, but what's also interesting, we talked about the 4 prods, right? However, going through the notes, so Gina Perry writes about this in a book, sort of looking at the human aspect of it all, seeing what the notes say about the actual reactions people had. In one experiment with one lady, Williams, who plays the role of the experimenter, his prods become incredibly coercive. In one time, he prodded a woman 26 separate times to carry on. Not 4, 26. So it's the experiment, the goalposts of it are changing slightly as it progresses. In fact, Williams gets more into the role of this authoritarian experimenter.
Right.
In fact, one woman in her notes afterwards wrote she thought he was a mad scientist because he kept pressing her to carry on.
It does rather undermine the results a bit.
It does, yeah. And what's weird is that in some variations, the classification of obedient changes when the condition changes. So in one condition, the learner is the one that wants to be shocked to prove his manliness, and the experimenter is saying, no, I want you to stop. And you were classified as disobedient if you refuse to go along with the learner who wanted to be shocked. I mean, the real power of Milgram is some have argued, is the assumption that everyone believes it's real, that they intended it to be real, which is why Milgram put so much effort into designing the set, the machine for the shocks, the actors getting the script right.
Yeah.
But it appears that many subjects actually twigged they were the ones being tested. They twigged, little discrepancies. Like one noticed that he saw a loudspeaker in the room, and he felt odd that the sound was only coming from one particular area, so he figured it must be a recording.
Well, I mean, any subject with a basic knowledge of electricity would probably know that once they got to, a certain amount of voltage, that their subject shouldn't really be alive anymore.
I mean, the other argument is as well, some psychiatrists have argued that many subjects carried on because unconsciously, I guess like you're saying, they believed no harm was being done. A, because they could still hear the person screaming, and B, because they were in a scientific setting, they were in Yale, and they subconsciously thought, well, no one will allow me to kill someone here. So they just carried on.
It comes down to the authority figure again, does it? So the authority figure says do it, so you do it, but they also reassure you that you are doing no harm, and you believe them. Yeah,
and it's interesting because based on the statistics, it seems only half of people actually fully believed it was real, and of those, 2/3 disobeyed. Right. So the ones who generally thought it was real were more likely to disobey. And so this comes from unpublished analysis by one of his assistants at the time, Takito Murata, who compiled data that was never published by Milgram on behalf of him. And he found in all 23 variations that people most likely to disobey and give lower voltage were those who genuinely believed they were hurting someone, which completely changes the face of the research.
It does. And also the people who suspected that it wasn't real. I mean, what's to say they weren't just having a bit of a laugh?
You say that, but the reactions and the interviews of them post, it says the other thing. Did you read anything about the secret 24th variation?
I didn't, no.
So all the experiments were conducted in Yale except for one.
Right.
So he wanted to do a condition where he tested changing the location. So he went to a nearby town called Bridgeport, rented a 4-room suite in a very generic-looking building, and conducted the test there. And what was unique about this experiment is that there were 20 volunteers, but two in the experiment. The learner was someone they knew, so he didn't have Jim there.
Yeah.
So it'd be two mates coming along, and then they would brief the learner to basically pretend that their friend was hurting them.
Right.
Which is ethically crazy.
Yeah.
But he wanted to see, like, if you knew the person, if there was a personal connection, would that have any impact on how far you shocked?
Okay. Did it?
Only 3 of the 20 went to 450.
Right.
So there's a drop in obedience when the person knew the other person. And even when they went to 450,
right,
the other person still wrote that they believed their partner was a person of good character.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack from this one, isn't there?
But what was Milgram trying to prove?
Interestingly, we mentioned about the effects that the being part of this experiment had on its subjects, but in a survey of the participants performed sometime later, 84% actually said that they were glad or very glad to have participated, with 15% choosing neutral responses. Many even actually wrote letters of thanks to Milgram for allowing them to participate. One man even accredited his experience for giving him the courage to refuse to fight when he was drafted for the Vietnam War.
You know, after this mammoth testing session over 700 people, he had all this research, but he didn't really have a theory to back up why he'd been doing this. He had an idea in his head that he wanted to prove, but he didn't really have a theory.
Right.
And the one thing he wanted to really find out was why people were behaving as they did. So once he got all this data, he decided he'd sort of try and publish his findings, and he sent them to 2 journals who both rejected it because he had data but no theory.
Okay.
And this was actually a common theme with his work. He didn't really care about theories. He just wanted to do experiments and find data and understand things, not necessarily ascribe to a scientific theory in the same way that we understand it.
So he wasn't trying to prove anything with this?
Well, he was, but he didn't really have the theory behind it. He would develop one later.
Okay.
But he would just send the results of the experiment to the journals to show, look what happened when you do this. And they were like, well, that's great, but how does it fit in with everything? Anyway, his funders actually ended up sending a damaging report of his work in November 1962, criticising the lack of theory, criticising the lack of evidence, and criticising how any way this applied to the real world.
Okay.
The American Psychology Association investigated his ethics in the same month. You know, this led to a massive debate about ethics around the experiment. Despite these blows, Harvard offered him a job in 1962.
Right.
So you know, there was a silver lining.
Okay.
However, Yale wanted to conduct a series of experiments post-interviews with people that had taken part to find out if they had suffered any trauma based on the growing noise around how could you have done this to people, what are the concerns over the ethics. These began in February 1963 and ended in May and were conducted by another psychologist named Paul Herrera. And he was very interested in hearing out the subjects who took part and getting to the bottom of their feelings. Milgram saw this as a chance to find out why they behaved as they did, so also got involved.
Yeah.
But people were reluctant to turn up because they were scared it was another experiment.
Okay.
So out of 780 subjects that took part in the experiment, 140 were invited. How many do you think showed up?
I'm going to say 70.
32.
Oh, right, about a quarter then.
And a lot of the time was spent by Herrera trying to counter fears it was another experiment. But what the interviews gave to Milgram was also insight that a lot of people hadn't even been debriefed. And he would come out sometimes to reassure them and soothe any fears, but he would get equally defensive when challenged on the ethics. So in a weird way, he poured scorn on those who were obedient in the test, but demanded obedience in whatever he did. So it's a bit of hypocrisy.
Yeah.
Essentially, the investigation proved good for him. Of the people he spoke to, he found no evidence they'd suffered harm. So he was kind of vindicated in that respect.
Okay. So this effectively cleared him, did it, professionally, or?
The major criticism was still to come. Because when you publish something in a scientific journal, it can be up to a year for someone to give you a rebuttal. But he would eventually develop a theory, which we'll just touch on, and that was, he explained the behaviour by suggesting that people have 2 states of behaviour when they're in a social situation.
So the results of the experiment, and as well as speaking with the participants, helped Milgram to develop 2 theories. The theory of conformism, which suggests that a subject who has neither the ability nor expertise to make decisions, especially in a crisis, will leave decision-making to the group and its hierarchy rather than following their own personal moral compass. And the agentic state theory, which suggests that when a subject comes to view themselves as an instrument for carrying out the wishes of another person, they no longer see themselves responsible for their actions. So no matter what the instruction, they can happily unburden themselves of any moral obligations they may have otherwise had.
So it took him a while, but he got he got to a theory.
Yeah. People will either do whatever the crowd is doing, or they'll do what the boss tells them to do. Either way, that kind of any kind of moral issues are kind of transferred from the person doing it to whoever the authority happens to be, the group or the person in charge.
Yeah, but at the same time, this also doesn't tally up with what the actual experiments were seeing, because every single person that took part objected in some form at some point.
Yeah.
But even when they were both classified as obedient and disobedient. So the classification for being obedient was basically going all the way, and being disobedient was stopping after the prods and not going all the way. But every single one of the subjects described having a hard time inflicting pain on someone else. It was obvious they were all looking for ways out, and they would do this in different ways. They would read out the right answer more loudly to try and emphasize it to the learner. They would offer to change places with the learner, saying, "He can't take it, let me do it." There were loads of different ways that people actively looked to stop causing pain, and it's something he sort of doesn't really pay much attention to when he's publishing his research.
Yeah, I mean, his findings, at least his interpretation of them, seems to whittle down to that people who do terrible things will essentially find a scapegoat, a way to say, well, it wasn't really my fault. I was just doing what I was told. I was doing what was expected of me. It seems to be kind of like a bit of a get-out clause for people who just do shitty things. There was actually a slightly earlier study into it in 1935 by a guy called Floyd Allport, and he used as an example people who stop at stop signs. So anyone who drives a car must know that when you see a stop sign, you're supposed to stop your car.
Not in London, mate.
Not in London, obviously.
Traffic lights are giveaways to a lot of people here.
Yeah, and what he found was that if you plot a graph between the amount of people who choose not to stop at stop signs and the speed with which they ran through the stop sign, you end up with a sort of J-shaped curve.
Yeah, but I guess Milgram's experiments were more focused on just I mean, this is it, the concept of obedience, which is quite a broad term in itself. I mean, there are some who've argued that what Milgram did, he overlooked a key aspect, which was the social interaction between Williams as an authority figure and the subject, which had a huge impact on whether someone obeyed or not. He was just interested in, like, you put them in a specific situation. He wanted to see how they reacted in the situation, because he firmly believed that personality had no impact on this. It was purely down to situation. You put anyone in this situation and they'll go into this agentic state. When he finally published his first article, which got accepted, which came out in October 1963, he did not foresee the reaction to this at all. It came out in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology.
Right.
And 3 days later, the New York Times had a front page headline of 65% blindly obey order to inflict pain.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
He wasn't expecting that kind of reaction then.
No, especially a journal of, it's not something that someone's going to flick through in a newsagent or a store.
No. But I guess then you put it in context of the time. We are, as we said, this wasn't long after the Nazi war trials, and there were big questions. The Holocaust was a lot of what seemed to be very normal people doing terrible things, and I guess it's natural to want to know why.
The biggest criticism actually came from an article produced by Diana Baumrind, who questions his ethics, his process, the value of the research. It really, really laid into him. And it led to the APA, the American Psychological Association, basically investigating and caused Harvard to dispense with his services. He had to take a job at a New York university, a non-Ivy League school. And he only got the job because a mate of his said, "You can hire me, but you need to take him."
Right.
So there was the media were very much into it. And remember, this is the early 60s. You've got the burgeoning civil rights movement, the feminism movement. You've got times are changing. So when he conducted his research, he was doing it in a space that was, as we said, the Wild West.
Yeah.
And now suddenly that was no longer acceptable. He had doubts over the torment he put people through. And he questioned at times whether it was ambition of altruism that he was pursuing this research. He questioned everything. But by the time he publishes his book in 1974, 12 years after the experiments, he, as we said, he concluded that what he did was right, and that it wasn't personality or background, but there was an inborn tendency to obey that was invoked by particular situations. And conscience keeps us in check, but once hierarchy is brought into it, individuals are put in a system, they become passive agents. That was the argument he was making. And he said his research demonstrated this, and that what he did was as ethical as it possibly could be, but there was there's no other way he could have done it.
So Milgram clearly stood by his experiments, believing that they were, appropriate. Can we say that any good has come from these experiments?
This would actually be, his experiments would be the first public and wide-ranging backlash against the deception practices employed by lots of different psychologists. So as we said, Bamrind would voice concern over the distress he caused, and the debate over the ethics of this lasted well into the 70s. So by the time you get to 1973, the APA tightened their ethical standards. So researchers now had to obtain consent. They would have to disclose the purpose of what was involved so they could decide to take part. And the right to withdraw whenever you wanted was a key component of that. Milgram always maintained that the research wasn't the problem. People were just uncomfortable with the results, and he called it a tempest in a teapot.
Okay.
But outside of the professional setting, people were dumbstruck with this. They were amazed by it. They were impressed by it. They couldn't get enough of it. But just on the value of it, so they actually replicated them in 2007. A professor at Santa Clara named Jerry Berger was asked to replicate them by ABC. Producers, naively, wanted to see if people were less robotic and obedient than they were in the 60s. So they obviously bought into the idea that people back then were more obedient.
Yeah.
So after massive consultations, Jerry spoke to the APA. They went through all the sort of guidelines. He found out that the moment people start getting a sense of trauma in the experiment was when people went to 150 volts. So that's where he decided to stop the experiment.
Okay.
So he got the go-ahead to do this experiment.
Yeah.
And he replicated it as close to the original. He built a shock machine. He sent out ads in newspapers. But the key difference was he had everyone clinically screened.
Okay.
He was expecting a 5% drop-off. 40% of those who applied were deemed unfit to take part. So you can imagine the amount of unfit people that took part in the original experiments would have been a lot higher.
Right, yeah.
He also debriefed his subjects right away, which was missing from a lot of Milgram's stuff. And he told them the truth as well. He didn't just give them a cover story. He was surprised how positive they were. He found the process himself incredibly difficult to watch. He lost so much weight because of stress and not eating.
Yeah.
But he largely found that the results were the same that Milgram had found.
All right. So Milgram's justification for the ethical issues of his experiments, maybe...
Well, yes and no, but it's what is the value of the research? Because it's a specific setting, a specific purpose. Most of the subjects who took part were doing it for science. In fact, one of the subjects who took the original experiments took part said they only went so far because they were doing it for science for their daughter, to progress things. So it's this sense of that it comes from an altruistic place in some essences, even if they're doing a nasty thing.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things you can pick apart. But but the research is still important, and it still helps shape how people approach psychology today. So
yeah,
it's also worth mentioning he also Milgram shot his own film about this.
Right.
He shot the final 3 days of the experiment.
Yeah.
Which is where those images of Jim come from, where he's like writhing in a chair. It was interestingly, during those final 3 days, the only person to go to 450 volts was a man named Fred Posey, who's the man we have in the image of the video of the sort of crew cut, sort of an everyday bloke. He's the only one that went to 450, but he dominates the narrative. He's almost a third of the film. So again, Milgram framing it as, this is the average person, even though it's only one person out of the final 3 days who went to the very worst.
Right.
And even then, he all the way through, he's protesting, saying, "Let me switch places. This guy can't handle it anymore." Worse for Fred is that Milgram had promised him that this wouldn't be published beyond scientific circles. There he was. Okay. There he was, the face of a documentary.
I don't know. Is it one of those greater good arguments? Do you say that because it benefited society, that you can kind of go, well, maybe it was all right? But
did it benefit society? Like, I think, again, for me, it's a very specific situation. And with the inconsistencies, the fact that, you start off with the 4 prods, but by the end, you've got like 26 different prods being used.
Yeah.
It throws a lot of complications. I mean, in the end, he only used this sort of baseline study as really the way to prove this. So the other conditions were different sets, but he drew on all of them when he wrote his book and he did his film.
I mean,
but also it's another interesting aspect of Milgram himself is like he was a prolific drug user as well, which always makes me laugh. It's not something we mentioned, but I thought it was just quite funny, like, cocaine, amphetamines, marijuana. He sounds like he'd be up for a good time with Stanley when he's not shocking people.
He probably would be. It's always a thing, though, isn't it? When you look into the actual people behind these things and their personal lives, and you start to dig out things like that, and you go, "Oh, actually, that probably is relevant," but it doesn't really get mentioned that much. If you could read a lot of articles about Milgram's experiments, and very rarely does it come up that he had a drug problem.
But I like the fact that when he was writing his book, he was probably off his face.
He was loving life, Stanley Milgram. Yeah. So. A bit of a moral grey area, that one. Now, as is customary, it's time to do our incredibly popular quiz that I know Nick loves so much.
Yeah, particularly when I'm asking the questions. So, have you got the electrodes I sent you that you have to put on for this one?
I do. I'm in my special chair.
I'm just going to start at the full 450, so you better hope that you get them right.
It'd be a very short quiz then.
But, as always, we ask 5 questions, which are usually multiple choice of only 3 answers. Will, are you ready?
I am ready.
Just powering up the voltage machine. Question number 1. As we heard, Milgram was a very intelligent kid. He loved arts and theatre as well, and he was always coming up with different inventions. But he wasn't always going to become a scientist. We know he studied political science.
Yeah.
So what career did Milgram briefly consider before ending up in social psychology? The 3 options are A, theatre critic,
okay,
B, diplomat, or C, film director.
He did direct his own film. Now, did that come from a love of film, or did that just come from was that just a little vanity project? Yeah, he was interested in the arts. So, theatre critic, diplomat, that's a bit left field. I'm not sure where that's coming from. I might come to regret those words, but I think theatre critic.
Oh, I'm afraid that's wrong. It was he studied political science, so actually it makes perfect sense he'd want to be a diplomat. But he became sort of disillusioned with it, which is why he did turn to science. He'd always have that sort of conflicting balance between his love of science and love of arts.
He could write, he could do those little drawings for The Guardian of, Boris Johnson eating a pie or whatever it is they do.
So, question number 2. Yale was where the experiment famously took place. Now, Yale, interestingly, has 40 libraries. That's a lot of books.
Yes.
The largest of which is the Sterling Memorial Library, which is equivalent to the size of one city block in America.
Okay.
So, in total, these 40 libraries hold 14 million books. How many books are contained in the Sterling Memorial Library? Is it A, 4 million, B, 6 million, or C, 8 million?
Just as an aside, do you think these 40 libraries have Yale locks on the doors? I actually have no idea. Maybe I should read more. I'm going to go with the big number. Is it 8 million? C.
I'm afraid not. It's actually 4 million.
Oh, it's a small number.
I'm actually slightly disappointed it's only 14 million in total for 40 libraries. That feels small to me.
You think that they need more Mills and Boons, do they? Or
yeah, definitely.
Danielle Steele's?
Yes. Right. The television movie, based on the experiments of Milgram, and starring William Shatner, was called The 10th Level. It came out in August 1976, and it sort of parodied his life. It revolved around a normal but very handsome scientist obsessed with the Nazis.
Yeah.
Weirdly, Milgram hated this, but he also actually helped create it because he was asked to work on it and got paid some money for it. But
wouldn't you love to be played by William Shatner in a film?
Not right now, no.
It's
a bit past it. But but this is a very esoteric question. What channel did the film debut to 30 million viewers in America?
In America? Yeah. Sorry.
Was it A, ABC?
Yeah.
B, BBC?
Yeah.
Or C, CBS?
These are just letters. I don't know American TV channels.
I could have gone with NBC as well, but that would have been a fourth answer. So ABC, BBC, or CBS?
CBS. Yeah. What's that? Is that like the American Channel 4?
So CBS, they have a very, very rich history. They were the ones that broadcast H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds as performed by Orson Welles, which caused that terrifying Halloween prank.
Oh, so they're radio station as well, did they?
Yeah. Well, most TV stations were radio before they were TV.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Or they were joint. Yeah. But yeah, very old and respected US network. Well done, you got one right so far.
Good. Am I beating you still?
No. You'd have to win 3 in a row and get all correct.
Okay, give me time. I'll manage it.
Okay, next question. It's another sort of media themed one because these were the most interesting tidbits I found.
Okay, so this is like which Venezuelan radio station did Milgram like to listen to on his holidays?
Yeah, basically. In 2010, a French docu-TV show was created, which had a modern version of the experiment in the form of a game show.
Okay.
It was portrayed as the real thing. Contestants had to shock people for prizes. However, it was all a con designed to show how easily people are led and how they will do anything for a free T-shirt. Although that wasn't actually the prize, it was something else. What was the name of this TV show?
Okay.
So, was it A?
Yeah.
Remember, this is a French docu-TV show, so these answers will be in English, but it would have been translated into something a bit sexier in French.
Oh, okay.
So A, Shocking Times.
Yeah.
B, High Stakes. Or C, The Game of Death.
Can I have those answers in their original French as well?
No.
Je suis désolé. High Stakes.
You played for High Stakes and you lost. It was The Game of Death.
Oh, The Game of Death.
I mean, who signs up for a TV show called The Game of Death?
French people, I suppose.
It sounds more like a Japanese TV show, to be fair.
It does. Have you seen that Japanese program where the man eats a door handle?
No.
Okay, I was just
real metal?
No. It's a really realistic one, though. He walks up to a door and eats the handle.
Is it made of cake? Do you remember that was a thing a few years ago where everything was made of cake and you just it played with your perception?
I think this is another one of your fever dreams.
Okay, fever dreams again. I'll be playing The Game of Death in my sleep this time. Final question. So, as we've mentioned, Milgram published a book in 1974 titled Obedience to Authority. But how long is his magnum opus?
Yeah.
And I stress, this is according to the last published edition I could find on Amazon in 2010.
Okay.
Is it A, 256 pages,
Yeah.
B, 375 pages, or C, 498 pages?
When you say magnum opus, you don't mean his ice cream, do you?
No.
Okay. You said it's rambly, so I'm going to say it's a long book. I'm going to go with C.
And you fell into my trap. It's actually only 256 pages.
You're too smart for me.
He spent a lot of time toying with with how to promote it rather than actually really writing it. I mean, it took him 12 years to create it after the experiment.
You should have just called it The Game of Death. Would have sold loads in France.
Well done.
Well, just you wait till next week. I'm going to make it super hard for you, and there's going to be like 20 options, and they'll all be wrong. But maybe someone playing along at home had some fun with it.
Well, that is all of this. All of this we hope you've had fun with.
All of it is for the enjoyment of people at home or on the bus, on the train, on the toilet, in the kitchen. We had an email from one listener who said that he liked to listen to it while he's making his dinner, which I thought was quite nice.
I think it's because they can't hear us over the sound of a bubbling pot.
I think we found our niche, you know. We're the podcast to listen to while you make dinner.
Two idiots waffling about things they know a vague amount of information about.
Yeah.
But isn't that every podcast?
I mean, kind of. It's either that or it's a very serious sounding person spending a very, very long time telling you about a single crime. With lots of adverts in between.
Yeah, there's no adverts here.
No.
However, we are toying with the idea of buying us coffee. But then we'd have to get the tax man involved, and that's just too much work.
I love it. Such simple expectations we have. We're like, other people are like, you know, have like these advertising deals. Oh, you know, go to Squarespace and use our code. We're like, please just buy us a coffee. That's our show. Thank you for listening. It's a pleasure as always. I hope you enjoy your dinner. Hopefully you're having something nice. I think the thing to take away from this is steady on. Yeah, thank you for listening. Please do subscribe. We're in all the usual places. We're on Spotify. We're on Apple. We're on Google, though apparently Google's going away. So that's going to make our job at ending this thing about, 33% easier. You got anything else to say, Nick?
Bye.
But yeah, all that's left is to leave you with the clue for our next episode.
Land ho! I can see he is the sort of moist scallop whose feeble posturings I went to sea to escape.
They didn't go nowhere, they just disappeared.
They disappeared.
Except they didn't.
They vanished.